I am delighted to welcome you. AI and cybersecurity are not per se new topics, but I can't think of an instance where such a distinct audience converged with such unique presenters. Allow me to introduce the topic of cybersecurity with an analogy, a way of looking at cybersecurity, cyber attacks. Think of a seat belt in a car. We all wear a seat belt, not because we expect that something is going to happen, but because we want to be prepared and protected in case something does happen. And as you will hear in a moment from now, from gentlemen joining from the first row of the front line, the risk, the likelihood of that accident, of this attack against a business, if you are in the private sector of banking, finances, healthcare, oil, gas, water, or supplies, you will hear from the gentleman on stage that the risk is greater today and in the days to come than ever before.
I can't think of two people who have more unique resumes in the true sense of the word than Mike Pompeo and John Lee Ratcliffe. I mean, when you think about what they've done together, House Intel Committee is by far the hardest committee in the House to get on. You're picked literally by the Speaker. There's no voting, you're just picked based on your expertise and your acumen, and they both were on House Intel, which means the Speaker picked them both. And of course, Secretary Pompeo was a CIA director and he was a Secretary of State. One of the voices that I listened to the most and respected the most as a colleague on national security matters. And I remember the moment that John Lee Ratcliffe got to Congress. He told me he wanted to develop an expertise in cybersecurity. And I had the exact same question you would have. Well, I had two of them. Number one, what is that? And number two, why? And here we sit. He was right. He was right to develop an expertise in that. So, Nick, thank you for, number one, giving me a chance to ask these two guys questions under oath. If we could get the oath administered, I'd be. All right, Mike.
I've done that a couple of times. Great. Didn't always end that well, so, you know.
I don't know. The client would be a lot smarter than the lawyer if I were questioning you, so you'd be fine. I want to start with you. You served on House Intel, you were the CIA director, you're the Secretary of State, you have worked in spaces that would scare the daylights out of most of us. In terms of both government vulnerability and the private sector, give us your thoughts on cybersecurity as a risk right now.
Well, let me just start by saying thanks to Nick. Trey, thanks for being here. It's great to be with the two of you, dear friends. Smart. No, I said you two, the two of you. Yeah, you were part of that. The three of you, yes, exactly. How about this for a story? You become CIA director, and within about a week and a half of the time you arrive, you learn that the CIA had been subject to the greatest theft of intellectual property that the CIA had ever suffered. It had happened in March of the year previous. It had happened in March of 2016. This was now March of 17. So that's when the theft had taken place. But we didn't figure it out until February of 2017. This is Vault 7, WikiLeaks. Julian Assange had invaded probably one of the most secure assets that the Central Intelligence Agency had ever created. What it set upon me was something that I knew and that you all know too, is that no matter how good defense is played, that risk remains. And so I saw this with the Russians getting inside the State Department system, this public knowledge as well. The efforts that we make as a government, and when I ran a small business, the small company that I ran, the efforts we made to protect our assets are important. One has to stay at them, but this is a game that is forever. And it's no longer just nation states engaged in these attacks. You now have actors domestically, actors across the world that aren't countries, that have a very capable capacity to not only steal information, but disrupt systems in ways that frankly 15, 20 years ago didn't exist. And as we become more reliant on technology, whether that's AI or what have you, this risk is only going to increase, and the balance sheet risk for private companies will only increase as well, I suspect.
You know, Director Ratcliffe, he mentioned war, which we think of as sovereign versus sovereign. We don't think of these terrorist groups or these criminal enterprises targeting companies or governments. Christopher Wray, twice, the head of the FBI in the last month, has gone out of his way to warn us that something is coming. I don't consider him to be unnecessarily alarming in nature. So he's worried about something. Are you worried about something? And if it is, are you worried? I mean, critical infrastructure, what is meant by that? And what's the government's role versus the private sector's role to prevent that?
So Director Wray, Director of the FBI, who Mike and I worked with closely when we were in the prior administration, to what Trey's talking about, has warned that we have specific intelligence that hacking groups, really proxies for the Chinese government, have been attempting to plant offensive malware in our critical infrastructure systems. Now, this would be malware that would remain latent or dormant until such time as the Chinese government wanted to activate it, obviously, and probably in connection with a geopolitical conflict, either with them or with or where our interests were adverse to theirs. But this really, dovetails into what Mike just related about how the threat landscape from a national security perspective has changed. We all, grew up, the role of the federal government, the preamble to the Constitution tells us it's to provide for the common defense. And for most of our nation's history, that has meant securing the sovereignty and integrity of our territorial borders. What Mike and I experienced is that in many respects, a greater threat now exists through our digital borders. The United States still does not really have any, if many, near-peer competitors when it comes to hard power across the spectrum. But countries that can't compete with us in hard power or kinetic firepower from half a world away in a few seconds and a few keystrokes can dramatically impact our national security or our economic security or our public safety or our public health. And in that respect, cybersecurity is a great equalizer, and our adversaries realize that. Nation states, but also cyber criminals that take advantage of that. And so, Trey, to your point, we talk about critical infrastructure. So that everyone's clear, what we're talking about is industries and sectors whose assets and systems are so vital to our national security that if they were to be incapacitated, it would be debilitating to either our national security, economic security, public health, or public safety. And there's a presidential policy directive that says that if you're in one of these industries or sectors, and Nick kind of ran through many of them, you have certain obligations to try and safeguard that. And so it's our chemical sector, our communications, our critical manufacturing, our dams, our defense industrial base, our emergency services, our energy, our financial services, our food, our agriculture, healthcare, information technology, nuclear, transportation, and water. And those are all vital to our way of life. Those are all critical infrastructure that are now being targeted by adversaries and cyber criminals that intend to do us harm.
Mr. Secretary, when Director Ratcliffe was going through that list, it struck me that some are governmental, some are private, some might be quasi-governmental. I remember Jay Johnson, the former DHS Secretary, lamenting that he was having a hard time getting private sector and even some local government entities to accept the help the government was offering when it came to security. But if I'm a board member, if I own a company, am I wise to wait for government to protect me and to stop cyber attacks or come sort it all out? Or do I have an obligation to take affirmative steps my own and just not solely wait on Mike Pompeo or John Ratcliffe or their successors to come fix it?
Look, in the end, these are the kinds of attacks, the kind of threats to companies that you've got to take care of on your own. It is the case in many of the industries you walk through, there are deep partnerships between the federal government, sometimes state and local government, where I think of the finance industry and the power industry that have done really good work, frankly, post 9/11, to begin to build out cooperative information sharing, often through DHS, information sharing mechanisms that can help. So if one company is attacked, that entire industry is notified of here's the threat vector, here's how this works. But each of us, I'm now back in the business world, each of us has a responsibility to make sure we take that risk down. And there's lots of tools to do that. I talked about playing defense, right? Trying to keep them out of your systems. That's an imperative to try. But you should accept that failure will be normative. That is, they will get there. And so redundancy and the capacity to reduce risk through having backup and capacity that is distributed, so that if there is a risk inside of your system, you can do that. And I think every company ought to think about that, both from the perspective of the different elements of their business, the different locations in which their business operates. And then finally, I'd talk about the financial piece of this. There is increasingly an insurance market that provides some corporate protection for this. It's not yet as well developed as I wish there were, because it's very complicated to figure out how to measure risk there. But those risk profiles, whether it's a series of lawyers putting together protocols and the like, or your information protection team, it's no longer really about the IT guy. It's really about an integral part of your business. Getting that right can also, I think, provide you the opportunity to put together a financial model that can protect your company when the inevitable attack on your company occurs. I mean, most big companies are being threatened every day, often multiple times, by nation-state actors all across the spectrum, the same way Director Ratcliffe was describing.
So let me add to what the Secretary just said. To put it in perspective, we talk about protecting American interests abroad. When we talk about it in the military sense, the federal government, for the most part, controls what it needs to do that with certain partnerships. But when we talk about our critical infrastructure, to be clear, 85% of it is not owned by the government. It's owned by people like you. It's privately held. And so it's hard for the government to ensure, to your question, Trey, that it's going to protect an interest that it does not own completely. This has to be a collaborative effort, and as the Secretary said, post 9/11, that comes with some obligations and requirements if you are what's called a covered entity within a covered entity within the critical infrastructure. So you have certain legal obligations that you have to meet to try to make sure that you don't put our nation and its citizens in peril. And it is nation states, but it's also the cyber criminals. So, one of the examples that we all know that's fairly recent is, Russian hackers that shut down the Colonial Pipeline and essentially, held it hostage until it obtained millions of dollars for the decryption key. It's those kinds of attacks that are happening with greater frequency across our critical infrastructure, and really, why it's important for industry to understand its role along with the government, again, to ensure our national security posture, because part of national security is our economic security, and our adversaries and those that wish to do us harm understand that, and that's where they're going to target us.
All right, the very first time we met one another on the floor of the House, you mentioned cybersecurity. Actually, that's not true. You asked me why I endorsed the guy that you ran against for Congress. But the second thing you said to me, we'll have another conversation about that, but the second thing you said to me was that you were really interested in cybersecurity, and I thought, God, what a nerd. I mean, cybersecurity, number one, you were right and I was wrong, and it's painful for me to say that, but number two, you're in business now, you consult with businesses, if they're worried about what you and the Secretary and Chris Wray are talking about, what should they do? What would you do if you owned a large company? It's not enough, I guess, just to go buy, download some software from fill in the blank software company.
It's definitely not. And you did endorse my opponent, but the Secretary,
I endorsed you, right, John?
you did. You've always been a friend. You've always been someone I can count on. But what the Secretary said earlier, and frankly what Director Wray said, it's not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. It's going to happen despite your best efforts. So you want to do everything you can, which is deploy every technology that's available on the prevention side. So, are you hardwiring your perimeter, your network perimeter? Are you actively deploying monitoring of your network to look for what we call indicators of attack, anomalous activity, things that are deviations of normal activity of your network within your network? Are you encrypting as much of your data as you possibly can? Are you compartmenting as much of your data as you can? In the intelligence world, we talk about compartmented intelligence. And those of you that serve in the Navy understand that the idea that a ship is compartmented so that if there's a fire in one part of the ship, there can be damage, but it doesn't take down the whole ship. The intelligence community operates the same way. So can your network to a certain extent. So are you educating your employees? Are you monitoring your employees? Not spying on your employees, but monitoring their activity to make sure that they're not doing anything that would be anomalous to your procedures and your protocol. All of that is preventative. But think about it this way. If you have a company, think of it like a house or a hotel where there's a door and a window wherever you have an employee, and the idea, and in some cases that may be thousands. Those are entry points for those that mean to do your network harm. And eventually, all the training in the world and all the monitoring in the world isn't going to prevent one of those doors and windows from being left open and your network from being penetrated, which is why the second part of this is, then are you prepared? Do you have a response plan? Do you have a response team? Part of that to be able to notify the government agencies that can help you, and the government agencies that you're required to help because you're a covered entity. So these are the things that you need to consider. And at the end of the day, what Nick would tell you is all of that ties back to, in the eventuality that your company is subject to a cyber incident, they're going to look at your prevention, they're going to look at your response, and they're going to look at, were those things reasonable? Did you take reasonable cybersecurity measures to protect the data of not just yours, but in many cases your customers and consumers that you're obligated to protect?
Can I just add one more thought there? There are two other vectors that I think get overlooked from time to time. One you hit on a little bit. The Fortune 1000 have a robust set of capabilities. They get a lot of attention from the federal government for good and sound reasons. I was a supplier to Lockheed and Boeing and to Cessna and to Gulfstream. There were thousands of us. We were small businesses. Our sophistication compared to theirs was very low, and we had access to a lot of their intellectual property and to a lot of their network systems. And that was 15 years ago, before I lost my mind and ran for Congress. I'm sure that's even more true today. And so when I think about risk and entry places, that's certainly one that every company ought to think about, their suppliers and partners. The second one that I think people forget is the insider threat. When the CIA lost that data, it wasn't because somebody hacked into the system, it's because somebody walked in with an ID card that morning inside the building and opened a sluiceway, a data port, so that it could be accessed from the outside. As you think about not only your IT system, think about your human resources systems as well, and how you talked about monitoring employee activity. this is a hard problem set. It gets to privacy issues pretty quickly. But do think about managing access, administrative access, and all of those elements too to take down risk. It's part of compartmenting, but as much as we love the people we've hired and we think they're all good and decent and upstanding and driving to make your company better, there are lots of folks driving activity across America trying to put people in places where in the moment they can take these latent data sets that sit in software programs that sit on these things and turn them on from inside the gates, inside the internal infrastructure, inside of businesses as well.
So just this week, AT&T said it was a software update, but there was an outage, which to my daughter was more important than any attack on a nuclear power station or a healthcare system. That was a big deal, the 1 hour without access to her cell phone. Do you believe that we are headed towards more of that, that we're going to see? This may have been a software update, I have no idea. But I mean, you talk about disabling communication, you talk about all the things that we rely on in our culture. Are we unnecessarily scaring people, or do you believe that we are going to see that in the not too distant future from some malactor around the world?
It's a bit of a race, Trey. It's a bit of a cyber arms race, if you will. Yeah, I think you'll see it more often, but I actually think our systems are better today. They're more robust. Our capacity to recover. People have figured out how to deal with large segments of the ransomware problem set, not completely, not entirely, but there was a period of 3 or 4 years where just about every hospital in America was struggling to figure out how to get back the keys to their capabilities. But yes, I do think you'll see this with more frequency, but I hope that cycle, that learning cycle, will drive those to be less intrusive and more capable of putting these things back online. None of this is free. This is the other thing we haven't talked about. Everything that we're talking about inside of a business that you're trying to do to preserve your capacity costs money, whether it's people or software or redundancy. These are capital expenditures that companies have to evaluate when they're putting together their trying to figure out where the risk sits inside of their company on their balance sheet. But I do think you will see these attacks more frequent because the cost to conduct those attacks continues to decrease. And as that equation goes down, the capacity to create risk increases.
Director, while he was supplying Gulfstream, you and I were toiling in the vineyards of the U.S. Attorney's Office. We were federal prosecutors, relying heavily on Secret Service agents and bureau agents and you name it. Nick has amassed access to lots and lots of former federal agents and former federal prosecutors. What's the downside? Because I can't see a downside to having a fresh set of eyes. No matter how good my IT department is, it just seems wise to have another outside set come and look at my potential vulnerabilities.
It is wise, and it's a good investment. The Secretary talks about cost, but you need to consider it an investment because, again, going back to at the end of the day, when you have a problem, and ultimately everyone will have a problem, you're going to be judged by the things that you have done to try and protect customer or consumer data and to meet your obligations. And the team that Nick has, I know, are folks who have been trusted with our most important government assets and know what is required and what you should be doing. And you made the point early on, Trey. It's not like even if you have a really good team, technology changes and you need to update it, you need to refresh it, and you need to have people that are current and understand what the current threats and trends are. One of the things you have to understand is embrace the technology, and the reason you have to embrace the technology, whatever it is, when I say embrace it, understand it, acquire it, and deploy it. And the reason you have to do that is because the cyber criminals and nation states are doing that. And you want to be on a level playing field. And so, one of the things that is happening now is, the different iterations of artificial intelligence. And what I can tell you is that that cyber criminals and nation states are utilizing AI to their advantage with regard to cybersecurity issues and getting into your network. And if you're not deploying that in defense, then you're at a disadvantage.
Mr. Secretary, like any good lawyer, Director Ratcliffe just anticipated my next question to you. You were always how I defined artificial intelligence. When the speaker said you can go pick whatever member you want to be on your committee, I said, I want Pompeo. I thought you were artificial intelligence. But there's this whole thing out there called AI that scares the bejeebies out of most of us. Should it? And how are we reining that in? Because, not to quote Matthew McConaughey, but it does look like the Wild Wild West.
You know, it probably is the Wild Wild West. And I actually think that's a great thing. You know, I hear these debates about Congress is going to go regulate. Godspeed. I can't imagine them being successful at identifying risk, putting a statutory framework in place, and then some regulator figuring out how to actually enforce and execute against that. So my view is I'm happy with the Wild Wild West for a while. I don't think we should be afraid of it. Just like any new technology, there will always be bad actors. We have frameworks to deal with the excesses that are associated with that. Doesn't matter if it's in the form of AI or just walking into a bank with a firearm, right? We know how to deal with bad actors who steal stuff and break things. There are a set of rules for that. I actually think it is a tool that can actually reduce risk if we get it right. John talked about this a little bit. If we permit this to develop in a way where we get the economics right, and what I mean by that is we get the incentive system right and reward company behaviors that use these tools in a way that take down risk, which will be in the best interest of every company to do and their shareholders to do. I actually think we should encourage that to be done. And it is really important that we encourage it to be done in the West, on a Western model. If we attempt to restrict it or regulate it, you can bet that the very folks that John and Trey were chasing and prosecuting will run through the stop signs. They are unextraditable, they are unchaseable, they will be in pockets of the world that we can't get to, and they will mock our regulations and to begin to develop this at a rate that we can't because we've restricted our capacity to innovate and evolve, and we will have given an enormous advantage to the bad guys at the expense of the good guys.
Did you have another? I was going to
Not
follow
everybody
up on
in my party, in the Republican Party, agrees with that. There's Republicans who think this will be a bastion of the left, and there'll be bad actors do it. My sense is we should trust that the rule system will protect the system, and technologists will have the right incentive to get it right nearly every time.
And that is the most surprising thing that I have heard probably in the last 10 years, that the Republican Party does not agree with itself on certain issues. That must have just come up late this afternoon.
Yeah, it's a first.
I was going to give some maybe examples that would illustrate what the Secretary's talking about. So when we talk about AI, and I mentioned that our adversaries are using it, one of the things that you've started to hear about is using artificial intelligence for voice simulation. And just, I think, within the last 2 weeks, a British energy company made a $250,000 payment to one of its vendors because the boss called and said to make that payment, but it wasn't really the boss. It was artificial intelligence generated simulation of his voice. So, you know, bad actors are using that, but to the Secretary's point, AI can be deployed to your advantage. So I talked about, when you talk about monitoring your network, indicators of attack, well, artificial intelligence can detect anomalies faster than anything else. And if I wanted to say, give me a list of all of the attempted logins in our New York office, artificial intelligence can do that, generate that. Generative AI can do that so quickly and allow in our detection and our prevention. So, you know, technology is here to stay, and it's going to be embraced by those that want to do you harm. So, invest in it, deploy it, and use it to your advantage.
I got two more. I'll throw them both out there, and you can take them in the order in which you want. I really minute when I introduced you and said, I don't know two people currently alive in our country that have y'all's resume in terms of national security, what we should be focused on, what we should be worried about. So give us a couple of things maybe that don't get the attention it should. Like I've had you on my show before and I keep wanting to get to South America because all we talk about is China and North Korea, but there's some really interesting things going on in South America that impact our national security. So in this space or any other space, give us a couple of things that don't get the attention. And then my final question is, no one in this room, if you're in this room, you're successful. You're good at something. And one way to be good is to anticipate. So I'll wake up tomorrow and I say, okay, those two old former washed up members of Congress got my attention. They got my attention. Something's going on. Proactively, what can they do about it? What should they do about it?
Let me give you one from South America. I don't know how many folks are tracking the story in a place called Guyana. South America, not Africa. You all would know that, but many wouldn't. They will go from being the 5th or 6th poorest country per capita in the world to the 5th or 6th wealthiest country per capita in the world in the next 5 or 6 years. Massive oil find. Exxon, now Chevron are developing an offshore. They have 750,000 people. Think Doha on steroids. Staggering amount of wealth created. You should know that that's very close to here. It's a 2-hour flight out of Miami. There are now direct flights out of Houston. And the Chinese are watching it, the Russians are watching it, the Cubans are watching it, and the Venezuelans. Maduro is threatening to take these oil fields by force. So just something that is different, something that gets talked about too seldom, but a massive opportunity for the Caribbean and for the Americas. And if we can get that right, really good for the United States of America. If we get it wrong, we will have our adversaries wealthy on our shores way too close. The last one is this. We do forget when we talk about cyber that we're also talking about the information space and the capacity to educate the next generation of Americans. You should know that when you hear Xi Jinping talk about American decline, he is not being observational. He is talking about his mission statement. And one of the central tools that he's using is, in fact, that, to shape the information space here inside the United States. And we often focus just on TikTok. That is certainly a vector, a method by which it is being done, but it is broader and deeper than that. And that information space, what's going on in our schools, K through 12, in our university system that are dominated by Chinese Communist Party money in many instances, will shape the information space for our children and grandchildren. And it is intentional and has the capacity to change the nature of our republic and the West in ways that I think we often just, it's hard to look at because it's complicated and it happens over time. But know that they're working very hard on it. We need to make sure that we respond to it in a way that protects the information ecosystem so that the story of American exceptionalism remains being told in the most important places in our country. That was more than 20 seconds, but I took a shot at it.
You know what? When you're as good as you are, it seems short. So you could talk all night and I would learn something. What I've learned from both of you is you can have a fantastic ID department. You can think that you are up to speed. There is no downside to having a fresh set of eyes. Look, I'm biased towards Nick because I like federal law enforcement officers. I like former federal prosecutors. I like people who have looked for malactors in the past. My bias is towards Nick. But there's no downside to getting a fresh set of eyes to make sure that you're prepared. That's what I hear you two guys saying. Cybersecurity, AI, two of the foremost experts in the world. I can't thank you enough. And Nick, thank you for giving us an excuse as I hope you can see 3 former colleagues, but 3 current friends to get back together on stage together. So thank you for that.